As we think about setting as an aspect of fiction writing, I want to look at some short stories here for the course and think about how setting works in these stories. In particular, we'll look at various corners of the Midwest explored by Stuart Dybek, Ron Hansen, and Chris Offutt in the assigned stories here. Setting's a basic aspect of the story, and here you have kind of a collection of American Midwests and the various ways in which Midwestern life is depicted. You have Stuart Dybek's Chicago in his story, Chopin in Winter, Ron Hansen's Nebraska in Wickedness, and Chris Offutt's Kentucky in Aunt Granny Lith. I put quotation marks around them here because they are, the writers are not trying to give you an exhaustive sense of these spaces. That instead they're offering you a very kind of tightly defined aspect of the space through which their characters move. So they're not really trying to summarize a space as much as carve out a space in which their storytelling can work. Setting itself provides the essential details of the story. And when I look at a story, I like to think about the larger and smaller spaces that are represented within a story. And I'll show you some examples of this in a second. These are spaces of human interaction, either on the interpersonal level, on the personal or an inner level. They can also be spaces that are on a much larger social or cultural level. And we'll look at those examples in a second. Also, you think about space. Setting as the cultural and historical moment of the story, the where and when of the story, and you can kind of define that within each of these stories here. And also, don't forget that setting is kind of, in a sense, a stage on which the central tensions of the story are played out. So what kinds of things need to be set up on that stage for the writer to kind of realize his or her vision? First story we'll look at is from Stuart Dybek's great collection of short stories, The Coast of Chicago, called Chopin in Winter. When I thinking about the larger and smaller spaces here, the larger space of the story is the city of Chicago. It's a distinctly American city in the first half of the 20th century. So the city itself provides a setting for the story, but there's also a smaller space in which the story kind of transacts itself, and that is a boy named Michael who's coming of age in a shared and very confining at points apartment building in the city. So you can think about the city as a larger space, but then also the neighborhood and the apartment and the stairway as spaces that get smaller and smaller, in which the main character, the narrator here, defines himself. When you think about the spaces in which the story builds itself here, the kinds of spaces in which the conflicts are developed, you have a personal space where the narrator is growing up in this shared confining apartment. He has to kind of find his way through the world in relating to his mother, to the neighbors, to other family members, and so there's that very kind of like tightly drawn space around the I in the story. There's also the larger urban space in which Michael, the narrator, is defining himself, and so he's kind of trying to understand the city's larger social and cultural norms that define his place in the world, and also the generational spaces here, right? That you get, you have Zsa, Michael's mother, Michael himself, 3 generations living together in an apartment in the city, so they have to kind of navigate the different worlds that they know, or the different worlds that have kind of defined them in terms of age and such. You can read this story as a coming-of-age story, and we'll look at some other coming-of-age stories in the next couple units. Michael is very kind of attentive to the fact that he is growing up and is kind of taking in the world bit by bit. The story begins with a sentence: "The winter Zsa came to live with us," and so this is a distinct kind of marker in his memory and in his growth as a young man. There's also points here where you have to kind of realize that this is his memory, that the story, although it happened in the past, is not being narrated in the past. Instead, Michael might be much older when he's thinking back to these things. And so how does memory impact the setting and conflicts within a story, as he comes to realize that it was my mother, not I, whom Marcy had heard crying. When Marcy tells him that she has, heard crying, and it turns out that it's not Michael himself, but it is his mother who is crying over his father's death in the war. It leaves an impact on Michael, although he's not entirely open about his sense of grief here and understanding. And then the last lines of the story, I could still hear the silence left behind, kind of a sense in which he is kind of coming of age in terms of how he understands grief and loss in his life, and how that space has defined him in his life's development from then. Part of the ways in which he comes to understand the city's larger social and cultural norms comes through Marcy's presence in the story. He listens to her playing the piano upstairs, and he hears her playing classical works, but also hears her playing some more kind of jazzy tunes as well. And those tunes kind of bleed through the apartment building itself. He listens to her play and connects with her on a very kind of developing and deep level. She has come home from New York, where she's gone to college. She's the landlady's daughter, and she's pregnant. And so, Michael is coming to a very kind of slow realization of what that means to him and what that means within the city. She ends up moving out of the building when she has her child, and she ends up living on the south side in a Negro neighborhood near the university, as the story relates. And so Michael's kind of having to come to terms with how others see that and how he is going, or how he has responded to that in his own life in Chicago. Second story we're looking at is from Ron Hansen's collection called Nebraska, and this story is called Wickedness. The larger space here is a Great Plains blizzard, recalled in its detail and legend from January of 1888. The smaller spaces they had carved out in that telling, though, are the ways in which the characters develop a sense of survival within the conflict between the human and the non-human worlds, where the blizzard itself has become kind of a force that defines the space, that defines the Midwest in which they live. The spaces in which the story builds itself are natural. That the kind of basic conflict between the human and non-human worlds. Will these characters survive against the force of nature here? But also there's kind of a sense in which the storm itself is recalled within its own mythical or historical worlds, right? So some of these like individual anecdotes that are here seem like histories, and some of them seem like legends, and so you as reader kind of have to sort them out as you read. So it's not simply about how the storm is recorded in history, but more how the storm is recalled in human memory. The storm's wickedness, its ability to kill, and its ability to kind of define the heroic. So as you read, you are kind of forced by Hansen's story to redefine what your sense of the heroic is, and so you can think about the individual moments in the story. For example, little Cleo Schuster, who is kept at school by his school teacher, but she sends home the Shetland pony on which he rides to school each day with a note, and how the pony heroically arrives back home at the parents' house, and how they take care of the pony, realizing their son is safe. Or you can think about Matthias Achen's derangement in the midst of the blizzard. He feels the cold of the blizzard and feels like all the family is going to die, and so it sets him into motion on pages 262, 263. And you can read what his response to the storm is here. It's quite shocking. The blizzard is a force, a Midwestern force, in Hansen's telling here, right? That it almost becomes like it's almost personified in a way, because, as is noted on 258, everything about the storm seemed to have hateful intention as it descends upon the plains here, to a point where the geography is so doomed and drunk with snow that characters lose themselves and perish within this world. So this is another kind of Midwest, and slightly older Midwest than Dybek's story details, but is a Midwest in which characters are forced to reckon with the landscape and their sense of place within it. The Kentucky of Chris Offutt's Aunt Granny Lith is can be described in a sense like a rural noir in a way. That this is a rural space in Kentucky, and so he's going to kind of think about in this story the received traditions and legends within a rural world, but also the story engages a sense of the domestic space of a marriage and the points of memory within it. So the larger and smaller spaces are important to note here. You open with a sense of the household space, the marriage of Casey and Beth, and Casey has gone off on a drunk, and Beth has gone to find him and to take him back from the woman whom he's with, and so that household space is the primary space in which the story develops. There's also the space of lineage here, the ways in which Beth develops a sense of received traditions as a woman from her mother and grandmothers, how she feels a sense of linkage with other women, who have gone before her, and how she finds a place as a mother within that line, and also the social and mythical spaces that Offutt brings out here. This is kind of a legend, as the way it's told, and the Kentucky here that he relates is a very rural and confined world. And I say confined, I don't mean that it's cut off, because Dybek's narrator is also kind of cut off, and he lives in the middle of the city in this apartment building, and he is as he narrates himself, he kind of feels the world tighten on him more and more. So that sense of the rural confined world here is leaves room for all kinds of interesting things to develop. And Granny Lith here is a legendary presence. Casey, kind of draws her out of her cave in which she lives, and when he sees her for the first time, he says, or when he sees her for the first time, he's terrified by her. Beth will say, "I thought she was a ghost" the first time she sees her. But then her mother relates who Aunt Granny Lith is, that she is the one who fetched me into this world. Her mother relates, the last granny woman in these parts, and she would appear at times of childbirth within the community and would draw the children into the world. When Casey and Beth decide to have a child, they fear for Granny Lith's presence, and so what they decide to do is Beth goes to the cave where Lith lives and says to her that she can have her man for one night, and she encourages Casey to go down into that cave, and to have sex with Aunt Granny Lith as a means of, placating her so that she doesn't come for their child in the end. Casey is distinctly marked by this in the end. After they have sex, he says that she begged me to kill her. And so the domestic space, while they gain peace, in one way, there's also a sense of continued anxiety after the act, and but it also cements their domestic world. As Casey says at the end of the story, "I always come home," and Beth responds, "You're here." And so the domestic world is built in this kind of legend that develops around Aunt Granny Lith's character. So the question here is, where do you find yourself? In which of the Midwests do you most identify within these three stories? Dybek's Chicago, Hansen's Nebraska, or Offutt's Kentucky? I look forward to hearing your responses. Thanks.